Hello and welcome to Frost Over the World. Later in the programme, the former Prime Minister of France, Michel Rocard, that hilarious actress Miriam Margolyes, the imminent collapse of the euro, an author living with death threats, and we'll be looking for some good news as well. But first, Libya. Command of the coalition forces over Libya has now been handed to NATO. The Libyan Foreign Minister, Moussa Koussa, has defected, and coalition night raids continue against Colonel Gaddafi's forces. This week, over 40 world leaders and senior representatives of organisations including the Arab League met in London to discuss what lies ahead for Libya. Immediately after the meeting, I spoke to NATO's Secretary General, in the centre of it all now, Fogh Rasmussen. And here's what he had to say to us. Mr. Secretary General, Anders, what's the most important thing that's come out of today? Another new idea like the Libya contact group, or what's the most important thing for you about today?
Actually, I think the most important outcome of today's meeting is the demonstration of a clear international commitment to the protection of the civilian people in Libya.
And how long do you see the action, the NATO action and so on, how long will that have to continue, do you think?
We have done all the necessary planning, and from tomorrow morning we will be ready to take over the unified command of this operation.
Do you think that the UN troops, the NATO troops, will be tempted to arm the rebels?
The UN Security Council resolution is very clear.
Yeah.
It requests an arms embargo, and NATO has decided to participate in the enforcement of this arms embargo. So we are in this operation to protect people, not to arm people.
Can individual NATO troops or individual NATO countries, can they come up with ideas that will then be pursued, or will it all come from HQ?
The overall political control of NATO operations resides with the NATO Council,
yep.
Including contributors outside, coming from outside NATO, and we have got pledges from a number of countries. So the overall political control will be exercised by the NATO Council, and all allies and contributing partners have agreed to a set of rules of engagement.
Is it possible, Anders, that the solution to this will be partition between the west and the east of Libya? Could that be the outcome?
I wouldn't consider that a solution. On the contrary, we fully respect the territorial integrity of Libya, as well as the sovereignty and unity of the Libyan state.
Today's statement says here, Gaddafi and his regime have completely lost legitimacy and will be held accountable for their actions. How? How will you capture him?
That has already been stated in one of the UN Security Council resolutions. The UN Security Council has clearly stated that Gaddafi's actions may amount to crimes against humanity. Yeah. And that's for the International Criminal Court to deal with that.
Could there be a peace in Libya with Gaddafi still in power?
Well, first of all, I have to say that NATO is not engaged in that part of it. That's a political question. We operate with the aim to fulfill and implement the UN Security Council resolution fully, that is to protect the civilian population against any attack. But I think it was a very clear message from today's conference that the international community would very much like to see a political solution. to the problems in Libya. And clearly there is no military solution solely. And I would urge all parties involved to seek a political solution as soon as possible.
Barack Obama, in his book, The Audacity of Hope, which was in fact a pre-election book, said, "Why invade Iraq and not North Korea or Burma? Why intervene in Bosnia and not in Darfur?" That's a very basic question. I mean, why are we intervening in Libya and not, for instance, in the Ivory Coast?
I understand very well you asked that question, David, and I think many people ask exactly the same question. I think the best answer is that we have to judge case by case. Obviously, we cannot solve all problems in the world through the United Nations or United Nations Security Council resolutions. But in this case, clearly the Gaddafi regime started systematic attacks against its own people, against civilians who have legitimate aspirations to reform their country, to get a better life, and the international community finds it outrageous to see these actions from the Libyan regime. And this is the reason why the Security Council adopted a resolution, and we are now going to implement that resolution.
Someone wrote the other day that this situation in Libya could go on for years, for 10 years, 20 years. Are you in it for that long, if necessary?
Our operation will end when there is no threat any longer against civilians in Libya, because that's the purpose of our mission, to protect civilians.
And so you will protect civilians for as long as you have to. 10 years, 20 years.
I'm not going to guess, David. Definitely, I'm not. I hope to see an end to this as soon as possible. And as I have said already, there is no military solution solely. We need a clear political solution, and I would urge all parties involved to find that political solution as soon as possible.
Has NATO had to inevitably to take sides because of the no-fly zone? It must be helping the rebels and hindering Libyan planes, for instance. That's why it's there. So in fact, has NATO taken sides in this struggle?
I have to stress that we are mandated by the United Nations to protect civilians against any attack. And the UN resolution applies to both sides in this conflict. It applies across the board. We will stay impartial. But I also have to say that what we have seen until now has been systematic attacks from the Gaddafi regime against its own people. And this is a reason why the coalition has targeted Gaddafi's armed forces. So it may look like the coalition taking side. But the reason is that it is the Gaddafi regime that attacks its own people.
Our thanks there to Anders Fogh Rasmussen, very, very direct as ever. One country has been at the forefront of the coalition in Libya. French aircraft fired the first shots at Colonel Gaddafi's forces near Benghazi, and President Sarkozy was the first head of state to recognise the National Transitional Council as Libya's legitimate opposition. But while some praised his actions, others accused the French president of grandstanding. He's also been fiercely criticised at home, and he's lagging behind in the polls for next year's French presidential election. There's even some question as to whether he will run again. I can just hear him shouting, "Oh no, there isn't," at the screen at that point. However, to reflect on all this, I spoke to Michel Rocard, the former French Prime Minister, member of France's main opposition party, leading member indeed, the Socialist Party. And as you'll see, he's not a man to mince his words. Michel, it's a great pleasure to meet you. Do you support the now NATO-led coalition against Libya or against the government of Libya? Does it have your support?
Yes, absolutely. I even think the decision was taken late. We have been colonizers in those regions. We have been slave merchants. Africa, even white Africa, and even more black Africa, pays a lot for what Western Europe has been. We have to defend the people against the massacres of a foolish leader. And I think it came late.
And
it was wise not to have troops on the soil, to protect the insurgents by air strike only, I think, and to verify that the Arab League and most Arab countries would support this move.
Why was President Sarkozy so disappointed or anti the idea of NATO taking control of operations? Was it because he wanted France to take control of operations? Why was he against NATO at the beginning?
Because history has not permitted to NATO to show a constantly pleasant image to the Arab world. NATO is an alliance of Western countries plus United States. NATO is on the side of oil and of capitalism, which is its role and our wish. Yeah. But one can understand that in their minds, that makes doubt. One can understand too that those countries are not yet used to the fact that NATO is a technical tool in which national will of the decision makers inside have always been preserved. But that NATO appears to be an anonymous and terrible machine.
And François Fillon, the French Prime Minister, said that under no circumstances, Fillon said, under no circumstances will French troops be sent into Libya. Do you agree with that?
It is always dangerous in politics, home affairs, international affairs, to say, well, like never.
Yeah.
Because change can change anyway. Speaking like that includes the hypothesis that Gaddafi's forces should normally lose in front of their resistance, and that in this combat there would be war, but not genocide, but not horrible activities. You never know. But probably the French president felt the necessity to give insurances. You still have in France some minds, some spirits, also pen, who carry the souvenir, the mark of Louis XIV, of Napoleon Bonaparte, and of Charles de Gaulle. But all that doesn't make good diplomacy.
Exactly.
We should be a normal country, discreet and silently efficient in human rights collectively. And we have no strategic interest in those regions.
And what about, someone described Sarkozy the other day, quote, Sarkozy is an American neoconservative with a French passport. Is that accurate?
No American neoconservative would follow Sarkozy's line on the G20 and on the demand for reforming of the banking regulations worldwide. No, I think it's a wrong analysis.
Not right.
Sarkozy is a discontinuous man and probably lacking the certainty of a coherence. It is political vision. Maybe too late international experience. He was a lawyer, so he was not an economist. Sarkozy in all that has no coherence, but sometimes has understood and chosen for a new regulation in the planet. You cannot make it so simple, but it's difficult to predict his behavior. Anyway, he managed in such a way that even with some injustice, because he has some sort of a reforming courage, but he happens to beat the worst record of the lower position polls of President of the Fifth Republic.
Well, his popularity or his unpopularity is reaching record levels, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is mainly for reasons of style. Mm. There is something secretly monarchical in the secret behavioral hopes of phantasms of the French Republican electorate. We have never got the feeling that we were forgiven for having killed the king. And everyone knows that the Monaco family is the best issue to sell many printed copies of our magazines. That's France.
Who do you think will be your candidate, the Socialist Party candidate? Will it be Dominique Strauss-Kahn? Who do you think it will be, and will they win?
No one knows. This will be our 9th or 10th? 9th presidential election under the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. So we had 8 examples in the past. No, 9. It will be the 10th. Only once has the final winner been designated as a probable winner more than a year before. Okay, so I'll keep your phone number and phone to you 4 months before our election. Tell you naturally, I have no reason.
Well, I think we'll be in touch with you and try and persuade you to run again as well. It's a joy to talk like this. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Ah.
But now, what of the European Union's response to the uprisings? Should it be doing more in Yemen, and Syria and Libya? It's already run into trouble on Bahrain. EU foreign ministers urged Bahrain's security forces not to use violence against demonstrators, but they also went on to urge demonstrators, and I quote here, quote, not to use deliberately intimidating actions. And there was no mention of the Saudi forces brought in to try to quell the uprising. Curious instructions, it would seem, to people who are fighting for their rights. Anyway, with me now is Edward Macmillan Scott, who is the Vice President of the European Parliament, responsible particularly, very relevant to this subject, responsible for democracy and human rights. Welcome, very good to have you with us.
Good to be here, sir.
Terrific. We were talking there about the reaction. You were really appalled by the thing that I just reported there. Not when I said it then, but when it actually happened.
When it actually happened. And then it was made worse because Cathy Ashton, she's the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, one of her senior advisors went on the next day to say that the forces in Bahrain were right to restore law and order. And a quite bizarre approach.
Yeah.
And if you'd said something like that...
This is Robert Cooper, yes?
Robert Cooper, indeed. British diplomat. He should know better. I mean, had that sort of remark been made during the revolution in Egypt, Mubarak would have seized it with both hands. Yeah. And it's giving quite the wrong message.
And he said that accidents happen.
That sort of thing, yes.
Yeah.
And you know, this business as usual approach really has to stop. The European Union is supposed to stand up for human rights, democracy, the rule of law, and that's the watchword of its foreign policy. But you know, when these things come out, it looks a bit as if, as I say, it's business as usual and not supporting the reform process, which is what we should be doing. And you know, I was twice in Cairo in the last month talking to those who were demonstrating, who are now looking forward to freedom and democracy and the rule of law, which they've never tasted before. And it's a remarkable thing going on there in Tunisia, elsewhere in the region. Of course, Libya is still to be sorted out. But for the EU not to support the process of reform is a grave mistake.
It looks as a situation where you've got Britain being first in doing one thing, France being first in doing something else. It looks as though the role of the EU has been fading and individual countries are going back to doing their own act.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then in the European Parliament, we've been absolutely appalled at this lack of leadership by the EU, that Brussels is sort of fading away from the scene, as you say. But this is our neighbourhood, it's not an American neighbourhood, and yet they're there. They're there politically, they're there militarily, they're there financially. You know, Europe is not just for humanitarian aid. It does stand for values, and we should be standing up for those values and not simply saying we're going to send in aid to Libya once it's, safe to do so. That, to my mind, is a rather pathetic response. Europe should not be pathetic.
So what else can be done?
Well, I think the first thing...
What would you urge
I would have expected...
that's not being done at the moment that should be done?
I met, a month ago, Mr. Jibril, who is now the sort of acting Prime Minister of the opposition in Libya. That interim council should have been recognised by the EU as an interlocutor, and in a formal way, weeks ago, and it would have given a massively important signal to the regime in Tripoli. We should be obviously accelerating humanitarian aid, but we should also be facilitating, in my view, the supply of arms to the so-called rebels, the people who are trying to reform in Libya, because it's quite clear that they are militarily under-resourced, they have nobody with massive training experience, and it's needed now to push the forces back towards Tripoli, as was going on the other day. We need external help.
No, but there will be people who say in that situation that's going too far, that basically, while believing in human rights and so on, that the EU should be more neutral in these situations. You're saying it should not be neutral.
No, we can't be neutral. Certainly not. Not when Gaddafi is killing his own people. That's the crucial test, and the International Criminal Court is waiting for him. But in the meantime, we need to make sure that rebellion, if you like, is successful, and we can only do that by actually providing the material with which they can win. And this should be available. Obviously, not European soldiers on the ground. As Mr. Jibril said, it's got to be a Libyan pen that writes Libyan history. And he wants no involvement by troops, but the material to win the rebellion must be supplied by the European Union, and if not, by individual nations, with the support of course, of the Arab neighbours.
Yeah, absolutely. Edward, thank you very much indeed for being with us. And we're going to take a break there, and in a minute we'll be talking to Harry Potter's herbology teacher, Professor Sprout. That, of course, is actress Miriam Margolyes, to you and me. The irrepressible lady will be with us after this short break.